So last week, if you remember, we looked at Jesus calling Matthew the tax collector and eating with him and his friends, which annoyed the Pharisees that Jesus would hang around with tax collectors and sinners. And they then challenged Jesus about why and his followers were not fasting like the Pharisees were, or like John the Baptist's disciples were. And so today we pick up from verse 23 of Mark chapter 2, and it says this. It says, "One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, 'Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?' He answered, 'Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.' Another time, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, 'Stand up in front of everyone.' Then Jesus asked them, 'Which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill?' But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored.
Amen.
Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the lake, and a large crowd from Galilee followed. When they heard about all he was doing, many people came to him from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, and the regions across the Jordan and around Tyre and Sidon. Because of the crowd, he told his disciples to have a small boat ready for him, to keep the people from crowding him, for he had healed many, so that those with diseases were pushing forward to touch him. Whenever the impure spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, 'You are the Son of God.' But he gave them strict orders not to tell others about him." I actually think that will probably be where we get to today, so we'll skip on to have a chat about that. Is there any verses or anything popping out there talking about the Sabbath predominantly today? Is there any thoughts on that, what we've just read?
Well, I have a question more than a thought, maybe, and it's always puzzled me that Jesus defended what the disciples did by saying, "Look at what David did."
Mm-hmm.
But does that mean that what David did was right, or was what he doing really figurative of showing? I'm not saying that he didn't literally do it, but was it just purely done just to show that that the Sabbath, it's. I mean, in the Old Testament, I can't remember which king it was, but there was a king went into the offered incense, and and he was sort of cast out or stoned or something like that because he had basically done something in the temple that wasn't allowed. So how did David do it and get away with it? And why did Jesus pick on that? It's just that's something that's kind of always puzzled me. And I suppose the other thought that I had just was in that you sort of think that Jesus sort of went through 3 years in blissful serenity, and was gentle Jesus, meek and mild, and he never got upset about anything, and it was all just peace and love and goodness. But we actually read there about where he really got angry and distressed. So he actually was showing the emotional human side of him as well.
Mm. And yet he was without sin as well. Yeah. So even though we go through times of maybe getting annoyed or frustrated or even angry, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're sinning. Yes, very good questions. I'm hoping to touch on those today. If I don't at the end, remind me and we'll have a chat. Is there any other comments or thoughts No worries. Well, let's go through it. Very good questions, Gordon. Thank you. So, verse 23, it says, one Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. Sabbath keeping for the Jews was and still is today one of the most important aspects of their religion. For the Pharisees, they were incredibly strict and they were rigorous in their attempts to keep the Sabbath. They were not allowed to work or to do anything that would risk breaking the Sabbath. But as we'll see, they actually missed the point of it completely. God gave the Sabbath to the Jewish people so that they can rest and recharge, not so that they would be burdened by following incredibly strict rules. And so here we read of how the Pharisees, they actually try and ensnare Jesus in breaking the Sabbath, because in doing so, they would be able to say that, well, look, God hasn't really sent Jesus because, look, he's breaking God's commandments of keeping the Sabbath. Well, as Jesus and as his disciples are walking through a field, the disciples, as you do, get peckish and they start to get hungry. But rather than us being able to stop off at a coffee shop, what they did, which was common at the time, they picked the heads of the grain and they would roll it in their hands and then you would start eating it. The Pharisees said to him in verse 24, look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? You see, the Pharisees, they saw themselves as the be-all and the end-all of Jewish religion. They would go around and they would judge the common people if they broke the Sabbath. In some ways, because they saw themselves as almost the champions of the Sabbath, they saw themselves as the police of the Sabbath. There was an incredibly long list of restrictions that Jews couldn't do on the Sabbath. Even picking the head of grain was considered to be work by the Pharisees. Now, we may look at that and think, well, that was crazy. I can't believe they used to live like that. But actually, even today, when Nikki and we lived in Newcastle upon Tyne, we lived in a community which was right beside a very large Jewish community. And on Friday evenings, they would make all of their preparations for the next day, as you know, Saturday is the Sabbath day. So they would cook all of the meals, they would prepare everything for the next day so that they wouldn't have to do anything. They wouldn't be able to work the next day. On Saturdays, some Jewish people from the community would actually come out of the house and ask you, a Gentile, would you be willing to come in and to flick a light switch for them? Because they didn't believe they were allowed even to turn on or off a light switch because that's considered work. So this mentality is actually still around in the 21st century. So back to our story. 6 days out of 7, the disciples picking grain wouldn't have been an issue. The Pharisees would have most likely ate grain themselves on the other 6 days of the week. But as soon as they see the disciples do this on the Sabbath, they immediately challenge Jesus and they tell him to look at what his disciples are doing. In other words, the Pharisees are challenging Jesus and saying, aren't you going to rebuke your disciples? Aren't you going to tell them off and correct them that they aren't allowed to pick grain on the Sabbath because it's considered work? Now, notice how Jesus responds. Remember, the issue is picking grain. And verse 25 says, he answered, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? Again, Jesus, the Son of God, references the Old Testament. As we know, he has the authority to declare things in his position as the Son of God. Yet Jesus uses scripture to defend his disciples. Remember, the Pharisees, they knew scripture. When Jesus asks them, have you never read? He knows that they have read about David and they have read about his life. But Jesus is challenging them, saying, haven't you read this? In other words, you've read this story of David, but did you miss the whole point of the story? Now, Jesus points back to a time when even King David was hungry with his companions, and they did something shocking, but they weren't punished for it. They weren't condemned. Although what they did was unlawful, they were justified in eating it. Well, what did they do? The issue, as we remember, is that the disciples are eating raw grain, but Jesus defends them by talking about eating the finished article, which is bread. He says, if you think that eating grain is bad on a holy day, just wait until you hear about eating holy bread. Verse 26, Jesus says, in the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat, and he also gave some to his companions. Jesus said that although it's the Sabbath, his disciples can pick the heads of grain and eat from the field. And that pales in comparison to what David did when he and his friends were hungry, because not only they didn't merely go into a field and graze on wild produce, David and his men actively entered the temple of God and ate the bread of the presence. This bread was the showbread. It's the consecrated as holy and is placed in the holy place in the temple. And this bread is strictly reserved only for the priests to eat. David, not being a priest, and his men also not being priests, when they were really hungry, they went into the temple and they ate food that was lawfully off limits to them because they were starving. As we mentioned before, these men, they weren't killed, they weren't punished for this, because the bread was made and designed to be eaten, and they were hungry. The Pharisees were willing to accept what David did because of who David was. Jesus and his disciples can eat grain on the Sabbath because of who Jesus is. That bread of the presence started off as grain, and it was separate and holy from other bread. The grain the disciples ate was just standard grain. The issue that the Pharisees had with them was that they were eating it on a holy day. And I've always found that fascinating, that Jesus responds to their issue over grain and reminds them of non-priests eating holy bread. In there is the challenge to ask the Pharisees. Jesus is asking them, well, what is worse, eating a clean food on an unholy day, or unlawfully eating consecrated food on a standard day? But either way, Jesus reaffirms that they have missed the whole point of why God gave the Jews the Sabbath. Because in verse 27, it says, then he said to them, you know, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And then finally, with the cherry on top, he says, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Jesus is saying that God did not give the Sabbath to the Jews for them to serve it, but he gave the Sabbath to the Jews for it to serve them. The Sabbath was given to them to make sure that they rest and recuperate and recover and not have to spend every day only ever working like they were forced to in slavery. Even for us today, God endorses you, God encourages you, in fact, God commands you to rest every now and then, to relax, to recharge your batteries. Jesus teaches the Pharisees of the whole point of the Sabbath, which is that it was made for man, and man was not made for the Sabbath. God never intended the Jews to serve the Sabbath and to suffer underneath it. God gave the Sabbath to the Jews as a day of rest and recovery. So although Jesus pointed to the Old Testament to justify the actions of his disciples, he didn't actually need to do that, because he reminds us that when he says, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, you know, Jesus didn't need to talk about David because Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, but he did it to rebuke the hypocrisy of the Pharisees trying to challenge him. Jesus would have been justified and responded to those accusations of the Pharisees by merely saying, I am the Lord of the Sabbath, I created the Sabbath, therefore me and my disciples can eat grain on the Sabbath. But he didn't do that. He first pointed back to the Old Testament. And so now we move into chapter 3, where this issue of the Sabbath arises again. It says, another time, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Here we see another hot button issue over what is lawful on the Sabbath. In this event, Jesus is in the synagogue, and there in attendance is a man with a shriveled hand. Now, let's take a step back and think about that. As you can imagine, back in those days, it wasn't like today, where back then there was no such thing as an office job. There weren't many jobs that required only extensive thinking and deliberating and sort of being really intelligent. Back then, the vast majority of employment was requiring to use your hands. You had to create, or you had to fix, or cultivate, or write. Having a shriveled hand was a disability that would have made that man's life very hard, and it would have limited his ability in working to provide for himself and his family. You know, back then there was no such thing as equal opportunities or equal employment laws. Back then, if you were a landowner and you wanted to hire men to plough or to cultivate your fields, you would have obviously chosen to pick the man who had two working hands to do that job. And so now we've started, over the last few weeks, we're starting to see a bit of a divergence in Jesus's ministry, how people respond to it. There's starting to be a bit of a split. We see now that the population and the common people, they're still flocking to Jesus. Jesus is very, very popular. However, we're starting to see now that the religious leaders and the Pharisees, they aren't as enamored. In fact, we're starting to read that they are in attendance, not in order to learn or not in order to glean from his teaching or to receive from God, but now they're attending specifically to try and to catch him out. They're watching him closely and listening out for any tiny thing that they can catch him out on. That can actually happen to us as well today in our lives. A lot of people, when they find out that we're Christians, a lot of them are fine with it. A lot of people can be very intrigued and maybe even ask a lot of questions. However, there are others who can retreat from you and watch you like a hawk. Some people are hoping that you trip up or say the wrong thing so they can catch you out when you mess up. Well, here we see the Pharisees are listening to Jesus preach in the synagogue, but they're not listening to learn. They're listening to catch him out. They want to be able to accuse Jesus of doing wrong. This verse says that the Pharisees in attendance were specifically looking to see whether Jesus would heal the man's shriveled hand on the Sabbath. And Jesus knows exactly what they're doing. Yet he still says in verse 3 that Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill?" You know, Jesus doesn't shy away from the situation. Rather, Jesus puts that issue front and center. He asks the man to stand up in front of the whole assembly. Jesus didn't shy away from accusations. Jesus didn't shy away from people trying to catch him out. Rather, he addressed it head on. He could have bowed to the pressure. He could have finished his sermon and left quietly from the synagogue, but he doesn't do that. Jesus has compassion on the man with the shriveled hand and uses it as an example and a rebuke for the Pharisees. Jesus addresses the elephant in the room, this big issue that is the undercurrent in the synagogue. And he asks the Pharisees a question. But it's interesting because he specifically gives the Pharisees two choices. And I want us to focus on this because this is fascinating to me. that what Jesus says here is actually very, very interesting, because Jesus doesn't merely offer the question, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? He doesn't ask that. No, Jesus actually takes it a step further, and he asks the Pharisees to choose between two options. Jesus presents only two options. He says, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil? Now let's think about what he's saying here. This man is standing up in the assembly. What's he asking? Well, Jesus is implying that it is good to heal the man's hand, and it is evil to willingly not heal the man's hand. In other words, what Jesus is saying is there is no middle ground in this situation. If Jesus was to leave that synagogue, having known that the man was suffering, knowing that he could have healed him but didn't, Jesus is saying that to do that is to commit evil. This is crystal clear teaching that if you have the ability and if you have the means to help someone and do good for them in their suffering, but if you choose not to do it, if you willingly ignore helping them, maybe it's out of pressure from others, you haven't merely foregone doing good, but to not help someone, you have actually committed evil. It's an evil thing to have the means to help someone and choose not to. It's not a neutral thing to do, because our inaction in that situation is the wrong thing to do. Jesus offers the Pharisees a choice. On the holy Sabbath day, which is lawful to do? Is it to work and save a life, or uphold the Sabbath, but in the process harm or kill someone due to inaction? Who do they serve? Do they serve humans, even on the Sabbath, or do they forsake the needy in serving the Sabbath? This is why Jesus' reaction is so strong in the next verse. The Pharisees didn't answer the question. It says, but they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. Again, notice something here. Jesus has just said that there is no such thing as inaction, because in doing nothing, you are choosing not to help. If you choose to do nothing, you are choosing not to help. Well, here we see the same thing, because the Pharisees didn't answer Jesus. They remained silent. The question clearly has a correct and an incorrect answer. The correct answer that they should have said would be to do good, even if that good is on the Sabbath. The wrong answer would be to choose to serve the Sabbath, and in serving the Sabbath, you commit evil. But it's interesting that the Pharisees, they did not choose the evil answer. The Pharisees did not pick the wrong one. But just as inaction is action in and of itself, so too here, in the Pharisees' response, is that their silence was an answer in and of itself. Because they didn't choose the correct answer, it showed their hearts just as much as if they chose the wrong answer. Well, how does Jesus respond to their silence? Jesus' response to their silence was anger, a godly, justified anger. You know, Jesus didn't merely allow them to have their point of view and disagreed with them. Jesus didn't disagree on an intellectual level and let bygones be bygones. Jesus judged their silence. Jesus was deeply distressed at the evil states of their hearts, that they're willing not to help people just because it's a Saturday. The Pharisees believed that adherence to this Sabbath was more important than helping out your fellow man if they're in distress. Jesus is teaching that they have missed the whole point. For us, in our day and age, we can sometimes fall into that trap as well. We can sometimes think that we don't have enough time to help others, or we can think that we have more important things to do. We can sometimes see people in need. We can see people are struggling, and rather than help them ourselves, often we can pass the buck and we can rely on others, or even rely on the government to step in and to help them. Well, in the famous parable, it was the Samaritan who stopped to help the injured man. And those who walked past and did nothing, although they did nothing, actually they did wrong. We may come across situations in our life as we journey through our lives. We may come across certain situations where there is no neutral thing to do. That if we choose to ignore it, or if we walk past it, we are actually doing the wrong thing. Just like those who didn't stop for the injured man on the road. So after Jesus has rebuked the Pharisees for serving the Sabbath over serving people, Jesus, in the presence of the whole synagogue on the Sabbath, he plants his flag in the ground, and he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Notice verse 6. It says, "Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus." Jesus commands this man to stretch out his shriveled hand. And as he obeyed Jesus' word, his hand was completely restored. Again, just like the paralyzed man that we read recently, this man with the shriveled hand, he doesn't speak. We don't know what he says. We don't know what he was thinking. We don't know his level of faith or what he believed. All we know is that he obeyed Jesus and did as he was told to by stretching out his hand. And in doing that, in obeying Jesus, he proved that he had the faith that Jesus would heal him. In the presence of all, his hand was completely healed.
Amen.
Now, there's a split here again, because this man was likely to have been a regular attender of the synagogue. This would have been incredible for everybody to see. This whole community would have known this man. They would have spoken to him. They would have celebrated with him that he had been healed. It would have been a joyous moment for them. Except we read that rather than celebrate with the man, rather than receive the rebuke they deserved, rather than learn from Jesus's correction, the Pharisees storm out. They chose from that moment on that they aren't only going to try and catch Jesus out with his words, but actually now they're going to start plotting with the authorities, with the Herodians, how they can get Jesus killed.